Thank you, Gad. Thank you, dear friends, for being here. And a special thanks is due to the University of Geneva for opening this module. I think that all the things that I'm going to read now and the PowerPoint that perhaps will come at the end are all made just a footnote presented as a footnote to the module itself, because the module itself will show better than my lecture, better than the PowerPoint, why it is important to do what you're doing. So thank you for these initiatives. Quite often, struggling to capture a nuanced understanding of a complex problem, we revert to metaphors as we try to convey the complexity in words. When a metaphor becomes particularly popular, with time we may even forget its metaphoric origin. One such metaphor-turned concept is the notion of academic fields. This once useful metaphor, which allowed the development of deeper specialized expertise, has now become an ossified term, and the stiff boundaries it erects threaten to prevent a complete view of the complex studied material. In the study of the intellectual history of the world of medieval Islam, the available data is unevenly distributed. The picture they offer is neither balanced nor complete, and for purely academic reasons, we thus cannot afford to focus on one narrowly defined field and ignore the rest. The challenge facing contemporary scholarship is how to establish methodological guidelines that will help us complement the missing data and correctly assess the available material. The pioneering study program of Jewish-Muslim cultures, which is launched today, is a major step in responding to this challenge. From the 8th to the 13th century, a vast territory stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic and from the Caspian Sea in the north to the Yemen in the south was dominated by Islam. Notwithstanding differences between regimes and variations of religious denominations, the presence of Islam was a major, perhaps the major, cultural factor that united these territories, to the extent that they can justly be called the world of Islam. The lingua franca of this world was Arabic. Religious and ethnic minorities living in this world retained their own legacy and often their own cultural language, Hebrew, Persian, Syriac, Coptic, or Greek. But Arabic came to be the primary language, the language in which they corresponded with Muslims as well as with each other, the language they wrote and the one which they taught their children. Jews and Christians sometimes wrote Arabic in their own traditional script. Hebrew characters for Judeo-Arabic, Syriac characters for Kashuni, but the very existence of these hybrids demonstrates the pervasive, all-encompassing nature of the Arabic language in this period. The linguistic and politico-religious unity of the world of Islam created a unique common cultural platform for thinkers of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. A comparison with the role of Latin in the European Middle Ages is illuminating. As the literary language of the elite cultivated in monasteries and closely associated with Christianity, Latin served as the unifying, communicating language among Christian intellectuals. But at the same time, it also served as a cultural barrier for the simple folks, as well as for the Jewish minority, including its elite. By contrast, Arabic was used by the elite and the multitudes, by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. This linguistic commonality facilitated cultural and intellectual exchange. In particular, the intellectual elite of all religious communities received a very similar formative initiation into non-religious domains, philosophy and the sciences. They read the same books, translated into Arabic from Sanskrit via Persian or from Greek via Syriac. They read the same books written by earlier Arabic-speaking thinkers, and quite often they read each other. Since they all wrote in Arabic, also in matters of their respective religious traditions, they also had easy access to the religious texts of each other. As a result, even in theological and other religious matters, their technical and professional language, the approach, the presuppositions, the ideas explored, and the terminology in which they were couched is remarkably similar, regardless of the religious affiliation of the author. This common scientific language is particularly striking in the realm of philosophy and science, since in these domains there are many issues which were not perceived as requiring a particularistic religious statement. It is not unusual to find pages upon pages of written Arabic texts which bear no identifying mark of the religious affiliation of its author. When such pages are found only as disconnected fragments with no title and no colophon, we are hard put to identify their author as a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. It is important to bear in mind these general observations regarding the commonality of medieval Arabic philosophy as we focus upon Islamic Spain. The period between the 10th and 12th centuries in the Iberian Peninsula was marked by cultural effervescence. Al-Andalus, the Arabic name for Islamic Spain, owes much of this effervescence to its multicultural and highly sophisticated society. The relations between the religious communities in Al-Andalus are often described in terms of convivencia, in which las tres culturas, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, enjoyed a parallel golden age. The development of philosophical and religious thought in Al-Andalus in this period, however, does not follow the threesome structure, as the Christians seem to have played only a minor role in the realm of philosophical thought in Al-Andalus in the period that concerns us here. Jewish and Muslim thought, on the other hand, flourished, and the literary output of Al-Andalus includes some of the highlights of Jewish and Muslim philosophy, theology, and mysticism. Modern scholarship on these two intellectual traditions, more often than not, focuses on one of them, relegating the other to the background. But Jewish and Muslim philosophies, which developed in this period, do not represent two separate trajectories which developed side by side. Rather, they are the product of a common philosophical legacy, integrated into the two religious traditions and expressed in the same language, Arabic. The study of the two philosophical traditions together, as tightly interconnected, allows us to better understand each one of them. It also allows us to explain some peculiarities of the history of philosophy and religious thought in Al-Andalus, which set it apart from its counterpart in the Islamic East. Philosophy reached its acme in Al-Andalus in the 12th century. This is the century of the great names, the Muslims Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Tufail, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes for the Latin Middle Ages, the Jewish Moses Maimonides. These are the names that spring to mind when we speak of philosophy in Al-Andalus. But obviously, no acme is reached without a gradual development that prepares it. It should also be noted that these philosophers belonged to the Aristotelian traditions, but what about other schools of thought, dialectic theology, Neoplatonism, mysticism? When and how did they appear in Al-Andalus? It is commonly agreed that the intellectual development of Al-Andalus owes much to the importations of ideas, books, and scholars from the Orient as well as from North Africa. Nevertheless, the development of thought in Al-Andalus is not a servile replica of what happened elsewhere, and one needs to identify its specificity in this domain. In the very complex picture of these developments, I will focus on one example. The Islamic conquest of the Iberian Peninsula dates from 732. The first philosopher known to us appears only 3 centuries later. Muhammad ibn Masarra is considered to be the first real local philosopher, and scholars, both modern and medieval, have attempted to identify the school to which he belongs. Until some decades ago, his name was known to us only through quotations and information given by his contemporaries, but in the 1970s, 2 short treatises of his were discovered. The paucity of information combined with the obvious urge to understand this first philosopher resulted in a number of speculations and theories about him in modern scholarship. In particular, scholars have attempted to identify the school of thought to which he belonged. This very question reveals the presuppositions of scholarships that came to bear. The assumption was that philosophy had been important to Al-Andalus from the Orient, and that, therefore, it had to follow Oriental patterns of categorization. In the Orient, scholars classify thinkers according to several rather clearly distinct schools of thought: dialectical theology or kalam, Aristotelian philosophy, Neoplatonic philosophy, and Sufism or mystical thought. Accordingly, scholars attempted to fit Andalusi developments, including Ibn Masarra, into these Oriental modes. In the East, the first school of systematic, rationalistic theological thought appeared in the mid-8th century, before the so-called translation movement, which made Greek philosophy a cornerstone of Arabic philosophy. This school, the Mu'tazila, whose adherents were known as the proponents of divine unity and justice, firmly upheld the primacy of the intellect as divine gift to humanity. Hence, they believed as firmly that the revealed text, that is to say the Quran, which is also a divine gift, cannot possibly contradict the ordinances of the intellect, as one divine gift cannot contradict the other. With these presuppositions, the Mu'tazila set out to harmonize the 2 divine sources of knowledge, the intellect and the Quran. They developed a thorough reinterpretation of anthropomorphic Quranic utterances that stressed the transcendental, incorporeal divine nature. They stressed these Quranic verses that emphasize divine justice and human free will, and they interpreted other verses which emphasized God's omnipotence and human predestination. From the 9th to the 11th century, the Mu'tazila was a major intellectual force in the world of Islam. During the 9th century, the Mu'tazila even played an important role in the political arena of the Abbasid Empire, becoming at times what one may call a state doctrine. During this formative period of Arabic thought, they made a major, indelible impact on the development of theology, exegesis, linguistics, literature, and science. From the start, the Mu'tazila developed as a school, with all the marks of a scholastic tradition, a structured organization for the transmission of knowledge, with a hierarchy of teachers and disciples, where the disciples rely on the authority of the masters to legitimize their own innovations. Members of the school overtly and explicitly identified themselves as Mu'tazilites. The schools developed a set of distinguishing ideas and a corpus of formative, almost canonical texts. As a school, the Mu'tazila was clearly a Muslim movement. but its intellectual impact spread beyond Islam, and the first Jewish authors writing in Arabic were immensely influenced by them. The Jewish community at the time was undergoing a major schism which divided it into Rabbinites, who accepted the authority of the Mishnah and Talmud, and Karaites, who rejected it, sometimes to the point of strict scripturalism. Both groups, Rabbinites and Karaites, were influenced by the Mu'tazila and espoused its vocabulary and its ideas. But the Karaites in particular adopted the Mu'tazilite doctrine wholeheartedly and made it the formal basis of their own Jewish theology. Now, with this complex information in the background, we can go back to Al-Andalus. It was only natural for scholars to assume that what was true for the whole world of Islam, namely the importance of the Mu'tazila in the formative period of Islamic thought, will also be true in Al-Andalus. This was a particularly logical assumption since the early Mu'tazila had a pronounced missionary zeal and emissaries were sent around, including to North Africa, to spread the good word. Further corroboration to the assumption of the early presence of the Mu'tazila in Islamic Spain was found in the historiographical and heresiographical texts, which occasionally accuse this or that person with ideas which could be identified with this particular school of theology, free will, or unorthodox ideas regarding the Quran. Similar accusations were insinuated also regarding the above-mentioned Ibn Masara, and some scholars therefore suggested, with the same logic, that this first Andalusi thinker must have had Mu'tazilite inclinations, which he had acquired during his travels to the East and to North Africa and to Mecca. Particularly intriguing in this respect is the information given by the 11th century polygraph Ibn Hazm, who admits that speculative theology was not very developed in Al-Andalus, but, he says, there were nevertheless several people who leaned towards the Mu'tazila, and as proofs, he gives again the same people mentioned by other sources as proponents of this or that Mu'tazilite notion. It should be stressed, however, that those accusations, even if true, do not add up to a full-fledged Mu'tazilite profile of those accused. In particular, the examination of Ibn Masara's extant works amply demonstrates that he was no Mu'tazilite and proves the unquestionable Neoplatonic nature of his philosophical mysticism. Some Mu'tazilite ideas must have infiltrated to Al-Andalus, enough to influence some people and make others quite anxious. But the totality of the snippets of information also demonstrates clearly that there was no Mu'tazilite school in Al-Andalus. Two 12th century local witnesses corroborate this impression. Both Maimonides and Averroes had strong aversion to dialectical theology and to its way of thinking. Maimonides states in the Guide of the Perplexed that contrary to their brethren in the Orient, the Jews of Al-Andalus had nothing to do with the Mu'tazila. And around the same time, Ibn Rushd declares categorically that nothing of the writings of the Mu'tazila had reached the Iberian Peninsula. The eminent German scholar Josef van Es has estimated that a certain branch of the Mu'tazila, which had been thought to be uncovered in Al-Andalus, was, he said, a mere phantom. One may broaden van Es's remark to the very notion of a Mu'tazilite school in Al-Andalus. Apart from fleeting notions and some sympathizers, it had no real life, no real presence, and it certainly did not constitute any entity deserving the name of school. This assertion is not new. In the early 20th century already, the great Hungarian Jewish Arabist Ignaz Goldziher had stated that no Mu'tazilite school had ever existed in Al-Andalus. And yet, like other phantoms, this one too has persistently refused to be buried and has kept hovering over Al-Andalus. Medieval Orthodox scholars had been haunted by it and had seen its shade behind unorthodox pronunciations, worried that it might jump screeching out of forbidden books, unsettling the distraught believers. In recent modern scholarship, the appearance of the epithet Qadarite, that is someone who believes in free will, or Mu'tazilite in our sources is again taken by modern scholars for granted as a proof for the existence of a Mu'tazilite school in Al-Andalus. In order to explain the stubborn recurrent presence of this phantom, we must look beyond the dominant Muslim majority of Al-Andalus. Despite the strong connections with North Africa and the Orient, Al-Andalus developed a sort of intellectual ecosystem of its own. There are various historical and cultural reasons for this development, but the simple fact of a relative geographical seclusion, the relatively close contours of what the contemporary writers call this peninsula, contributed significantly to this separate ecosystem. Within this peninsula, the connections between the two intertwined trajectories, that of the Jewish and of the Muslim intellectual developments, were even tighter than they were elsewhere in the world of Islam. In the context of the rather orthodox, legalistic-minded Islam of Al-Andalus, people with rationalistic tendencies were a small minority. The existence of like-minded people within the neighboring Jewish community necessarily invited intellectual exchanges between them. Indeed, medieval Arabic sources keep a record of such exchanges, Jewish scholars lending philosophical and scientific books to their Muslim colleagues who may have been more restricted in accessing such literature. The Jewish Hasdai ibn Hasdai from Saragossa, teaching philosophy to his colleague, the Muslim Ibn Sa'id. Maimonides, who states proudly that he was acquainted with the son of the Sevillian astronomer Ibn al-Aflah, and that he studied philosophy with a student of Ibn Bajjah. Within the small philosophical community, shared interests and shared libraries were a reality. And we must take this reality into account in our attempts to grasp the developments of this period. When looking for a deeper understanding of the persistence of the Mu'tazilite phantom in the Muslim Andalus, it stands to reason, therefore, to look also in the Jewish Andalus, known in Hebrew as Sepharad. When we examine the writings of Jewish, Spanish, or Sephardi authors from this period, one is struck by the depth of their familiarity with Mu'tazilite writings. Judah Halevi describes the movement in detail, while Joseph ibn Sadiq, who writes his Microcosmos in the mid-12th century Cordova, cites extensively from Mu'tazilite works written by the great Muslim masters of the school in the Orient. Both these Rabbanite Jews cite these Muslim Mu'tazili sources in the context of the polemic with Karaism, and this fact may be the missing key to the missing link to the Mu'tazili Andalusi phantom. Both Muslim sources and Jewish sources testify to the existence of a strong Karaite community in the northern part of Al-Andalus. These communities are mentioned by the 11th century Jewish poet and statesman Samuel Hanagid, as well as by the above-mentioned Ibn Hazm, who reports of Karaites in Toledo and Talavera. By the early 12th century, and for a very short while, the Karaites seem to have gained confidence to such an extent that the Karaites of Carrion, with the help of those of Burgos, impose their own Sabbath laws on the rabbinites of these cities. No writings of these Karaite communities came down to us, but the 12th century Abraham ibn Dawood tells us that in the 11th century, an important Karaite emissary, a certain Abul Taras, about whom we know nothing beyond this name, was sent by the Karaite community in Al-Andalus to the very strong and intellectually vibrant Karaite community in Jerusalem. According to Ibn Dawood, upon returning to Al-Andalus, this Abul Taras brought with him books of theology written by Jewish Mu'tazilites. He mentions specifically the books of Yeshua ben Yehuda, a prolific and influential Karaite theologian, exegete, and linguist. These books contain lengthy citations of work by Muslim masters of the school, and it is not impossible that the emissaries brought with them also copies of the original masters' works themselves. The Karaite community of Al-Andalus thus provides a definite link for the introduction of a substantial body of Mu'tazilite books and ideas to Al-Andalus, not just as floating notions and suspicious rumors, but as whole works containing coherent teachings. This corpus could not have remained restricted to the Karaite community alone. While the circulation of suspect books among the Muslims of Al-Andalus was periodically checked and censored, no such restrictions existed among Jews. Furthermore, as we have seen above, once books had reached the libraries of Jewish intellectuals, they were within reach of curious Muslim intellectuals as well. I have brought the Mu'tazila of Al-Andalus as one specific, complicated example for the complexity of the study of philosophy in Al-Andalus, as well as of what I consider to be the only feasible methodology to broach this complexity. The Mu'tazila, however, can serve as an illustration for another modern aspect of the research in this field. After the waning of the Mu'tazila in the 11th century, the school's doctrine was preserved by only two groups, where it is upheld to this very day, among Zaydi Shiites, mostly in the Yemen, and among Karaite Jews. This peculiar state of affairs is reflected in the infrastructure of research in this domain. The material infrastructure, namely manuscripts, hundreds and hundreds of them, is preserved mainly in two places, in the Yemen and in the Judeo-Arabic collections of Firkovich in St. Petersburg. No advancement in this domain can be achieved without bringing together these two resources, but the habits of adherence to traditional fields, which separates Jewish studies from Islamic studies, is here further aggravated by obstacles due to modern political and religious conflicts. In 2003, a workshop on the Mu'tazila was convened at the Orient Institute in Istanbul. The provenance of the participants was even more varied than that of the manuscripts. Participants came from Europe and America, as well as from various Muslim countries and from Israel. Using intermittently classical Arabic, French, or German as their common language, these scholars, some of whom could never have met otherwise, worked for 3 days together, studying the Jewish and Muslim manuscripts written in Arabic characters or in Hebrew characters. The impact of that encounter on the scholarly work is evident in the publications in the following years. Its impact on the participants' personal outlook, even political outlook regarding contemporary conflicts can only be guessed. Like that workshop, the study program, the module of Jewish and Muslim cultures inaugurated today, is primarily a scholarly academic endeavor. And like that workshop, it is likely to contribute to creating a dynamic web of knowledge whose impact on those that participate in it can only be guessed. Thank you very much.
I'm very honored to stand before you today and grateful for the invitation. And although it contained a little bit of excitement, the journey, after all, you know, what is a journey about but to have excitement, so it was fine. The title of my talk, after the brilliant lecture we heard, is one unique, and one comes in between commas. So it's not is one, is one, the word. That is one unique in that sense. And in a sense, this talk is an example, if you like, of the dialogue or exchange, philosophical exchange, that went on in the medieval period and about which we heard a little bit from Sarah. Now, given that the title is one unique, I start the essay by saying that this is not an essay about vanity. I'm not talking about oneself. Rather, what follows is a brief journey into the writings and minds of Aristotle and three medieval philosophers or thinkers, one Muslim by the name of Al-Kindi, one Christian by the name of Yahya ben Adi, and one Jew by the name of Al-Muqammas. You are at liberty, of course, to consider this a political journey, but it is really a journey beyond politics. At the end of this session, we're going to see, I think, a little bit about this initiative that we had come up with on medieval thought. And as part of it, as a component, I taught a course last term from which I actually put together the thoughts in this paper. So this arises from that course. The journey begins with Aristotle's metaphysics, for whom the being one, or to be one, was just as problematic as being, or to be. Indeed, was so problematic, he proclaimed such issues to be the most obtuse in philosophy. We can immediately get a sense of what the problem is when we ask ourselves the question whether these two, that is, to be and to be one, are the same or not, or whether, more specifically, some things being one adds anything to that something's being. Put differently, is there any difference to speak of between something being or existing and that something being, whatever else we want to say about it, just that one thing? One could already see that the very same problem is already encountered in invoking the word something or the expression a thing. Wouldn't we simply be repeating ourselves if we said that something is one thing? That is, if we already identified it in our minds or by our minds as something which is describable as one thing. And if we would not be repeating ourselves, what exactly would we be adding? What would be adding? I chose as the title of this presentation the question, is one unique? Deliberately placing the word one in quotations, by way of consciously shifting our focus from the so-called external world to that of language, in order precisely to allow ourselves to try to make out a difference between something existing and that thing being called or described as one, or as having an attribute or a quality of being one. By so highlighting it as a non-primary or as a non-subject, or by so detaching it from the primary object or substance itself in the external world, we can at least try to allow ourselves to regard such an appellation or description or quality or attribute as simply being on a par with the less problematic, for instance, being blue, or being octagonal, or as occupying a particular time-space coordinate. And as a next step, we can allow ourselves then to proceed to a second-level discourse, where one can begin to consider how to view or to describe this oneness, exactly as we might view or pronounce an opinion on the quality of blueness a particular painting or a wall, for example, has. As we might say, this blueness is bright or fluorescent, whereas that is less so, is not so at all. But would we really be justified in taking such steps, or in our so regarding the appellation or attribute of being one? Can we really view oneness as we view blueness? Can we detach, in other words, the oneness of something from it the way we can detach in our imagination the blueness of the wall from it? Our last question invokes our initial problem. Can we really separate? Is there a separation between objects out there in the world and there being one each? Isn't the very fact that they are, or we see them as, separate objects the same as their being, or as our seeing them as, one each? After all, I can imagine this wall having a color other than blue, but I do not even know how to begin to imagine this wall not being a this. Imagining this bit of structure as part of a larger edifice rather than as a wall is another exercise altogether, and it begs the question in this context of whether there is, independently of the observer, a this to imagine anything about. We are again, therefore, confronted with the question whether being and unity, the being and the being a one, or a this, are the same or different from one another. And what, if they're different from one another, the difference between them might be. Aristotle tells us that besides their being the hardest and most necessary of all things for having knowledge, people have differed over how to regard them, whether as ultimate or primary, as Pythagoras and Plato have regarded them, or as secondary elements, having or subsisting in a more basic substratum, as the natural philosophers, for example, Empedocles, who saw them as aspects of eros, seem to have viewed them. In all cases, he further reminds us that these philosophers, like Parmenides, who postulated that unity itself and being itself are primary, have come to the even more confounding conclusion, perhaps even have had to come to it, that everything that there is one, and that is being. Although, as his way is, Aristotle then proceeds in a step-by-step and studied manner to enumerate for us the different ways we use or understand the appellation to be one, beginning most importantly for our later discussion with the distinction he makes out between what is one by nature and what is one by accident, the ultimate obtuseness of the inquiry whether being one being are the same or different not only remains, but it grows further as God comes into the picture, shedding, as we shall see, philosophical speculations beyond where Aristotle himself might have ventured. In particular, no sooner do we reach the medieval Islamic period and the primarily Arabic philosophical milieu than we find ourselves immediately confronted with these far-reaching philosophical speculations, inspired on the one hand by an already firm religious belief regarding monotheism or God's oneness, but already being challenged, on the other hand, by a very robust pre-existing Christian controversy over the matter, as, for example, in the epistle on Aristotle's treatment of unity by the Athenian Ammonius Hermaea, who lived in the 6th century. It was naturally Muslim theologians who devoted their energies to the defense of the monotheist cause against all kinds of pre-existing and contemporaneous belief systems, religious and otherwise, including dualism and Trinitarianism, ancient and modern. Our three interlocutors dealt with the question of what one means, on the other hand, within the framework of what could be viewed as the philosophical tradition, by which is meant specifically the received tradition of Aristotle and his commentators, and the terms of reference they used. Al-Kindi, the so-called first Arab philosopher, devoted at least 2 separate works to the issue of what it is to be one, or what one means, in one of which he seems to have directly addressed Trinitarianism, Unfortunately, the work carrying the title On Oneness is not extant, but his extant work on First Philosophy treats of the matter quite extensively and, as I shall show, also quite shockingly. Now, it should go without saying that the shock, I mean, is purely philosophical and retrospective, or one that can presumably only be felt by a decontextualized philosophical reading of the relevant texts. Although the puzzling claim does not so much have to do with whether God can or cannot be three, yet it is precisely through invoking Al-Kindi's counterclaim to Trinitarianism, or of what it means for God, and by implication for everything else, to be one, that the philosophical shock which is meant can be felt. But to appreciate his counterclaim, it may be best to begin by explaining the claim itself. In his epistle on oneness, which may have been influenced by the aforementioned epistle by Ammonius, our second interlocutor, Yahya ben Adi, a Trinitarian Jacobite, explicitly sets out to challenge his Nestorian co-religionists, as well as Muslim thinkers such as Al-Kindi, on what it means for God to be one, by stipulating that, considering the six different manners Aristotle already enumerated of what one or oneness might mean, God can be shown to be both one as well as many in accordance with one of these manners, namely the manner in which what we call one is identified to be so by definition. Simply, Yahya argues that if an object being identified as one is identified as being so specifically by means of a definition, then the same object can also be picked out by another definition, such that the object can both be one and more than one at the same time, though in different respects. It is questionable how faithful to Aristotle Yahya is being here, and indeed it is significant that he does not insist on using the term definition in this context, and suggests eventually also using the term description or descriptive phrase, as though the two terms were interchangeable. Referring by way of example to planes or lines or figures that can change in size, Aristotle himself at one point seems to suggest that two objects being picked out by two definitions that are indivisible from one another, each of which stating the essence of that object, can in fact be called one. But the objects in question Aristotle seems to be talking about here are objects that are one in form, though there are different instances of that form. Our third interlocutor, the Jewish Al-Muqammas, on whose extant text on the question of oneness we should defer to my colleague Sarah, here, Strumza, squarely takes on Jacobite and Melchite Trinitarianism in his own treatise on the oneness of God, arguing that two of the common meanings of oneness, that is, that something can be understood as being one, both qua being itself, as well as qua the acts that proceed from it, are meanings which can also explain what we mean by one as this applies to God, while other meanings, such as something's being one qua its genus or its species to other manners of being one as first enumerated by Aristotle, would not apply in God's case, as both of these presuppose the compositeness of the object being identified, and God, of course, not being a composite. It is arguable that Yahya's manner of defining the oneness of God escapes Al-Muqammas's criticism, as his point is that in the case of God it is the definitions that are more than one, but not God or the thing itself. Or put differently, his point is that the thing itself is one thing, but it happens to have, in the case of God, three definitions. This is arguably different in the case of the species, where indeed the object itself is admittedly a composite. Actually, Yahya would concur with Al-Muqammas that God's oneness can also be understood as being so, both qua God being himself and qua God's acts. He would call these aspects modalities or modes of oneness, over and above its different meanings which were already spelled out by Aristotle, and which include his preferred meaning of oneness as well as manyness for God, namely that he is so by definition. Al-Muqammas, for his part, inclines towards concluding that the only acceptable means of explaining what it is for God to be one is for him to be one qua being himself, or unique, as well as qua his acts, meaning that there is none other like him, nor any similitudes of any of his acts. Yahya has an amusing argument to challenge this way of understanding what one means, as said uniquely of something, that there is none other like it, the argument Al-Muqammas uses, by saying, amongst other things, that this very way of setting something apart also sets apart whatever other object there is that is being set apart from it, by identifying it as being different from the first, so that there will by necessity be another object at least sharing the attribute our first object has of not having an attribute that it shares with the second object. Actually, the full argument runs into saying that if you separate one thing from the others, from the other things in the world, by saying there's none other like it, then you end up having to conclude that all objects are different from each other, having that attribute. So they're the same in being different from each other. So it's not a good argument. That is the argument that Yahya brings. Of course, there's no way to get over the rational wonderment one can always feel at everything to do with God, including for our purposes here the issue of whether and how one can make sense of Trinity or indeed of oneness. The late Cambridge philosopher Bernard Williams, in referring to the so-called Tertullian paradox, comes closest perhaps to offering an account, also arguably paradoxical, of what it means to use as justification for an irrational belief, as in an article of faith, that it significantly lacks any rational justification, that the very justification is itself the absence of any rationale behind it. This claim might seem to be suitable where God is concerned, but the wonderment I'm referring to here, the shocking element, does not have to do with a belief about God, but is the belief Al-Kindi, for one, has us have in something about the created world itself, resulting from his strongly held monotheistic view that of all beings, God alone is truly one. In pursuit of the explication of how God is indeed and truly one, he finds himself adopting the extraordinary view that only he is one, he is so. That God's oneness, in other words, is unique. Not only is God not more than one, of all things he alone is truly one. Only in his case are being and unity inseparable. In everything else, they are separable. This claim that they are separable is what I called philosophically shocking. This is what we started out with, that to be and to be one. That Al-Kindi says that to be and to be one are different as far as everything in the world is concerned, except for God, of course. I must add straight away that Al-Kindi does not present us with an argument for this position. He simply states it repeatedly, nor does he address its implications on our understanding of the world. He leaves us with having to contend with the implications of his thesis by ourselves. The other monotheist in this triad, or Al-Muqammas, does not go to that length in his articulation of the position. Although in his view God is one, the category itself of being one qua being itself is not for him unique. It is a category that allows us to understand what it is for God to be one, but it is not true only of him. Likewise, the category of being one singled out by multiple definitions or descriptive phrases, Yahya's preferred meaning for one, is not a category that's argued to be uniquely true of God. On the contrary, it's argued to be a common sense, common means of describing objects in the world. In fact, both Yahya and Al-Muqammas do not choose to pick out definitions or descriptions or meanings that are unique or cannot be used in the case of beings other than God. Rather, they both choose meanings for oneness that are among those in common use, picked out or drawn from Aristotle's initial list. And they each argue that it is one or the other of those that are most appropriate to use in the case of God. But not so Al-Kindi, who takes the matter further by claiming that God's oneness is inseparable from him. But the oneness everything else in the world has or is categorized or described by is accidental. Before addressing the implications of Al-Kindi's claim, who seems to break a general pattern by insisting that God's oneness is unique, and who by breaking this pattern invites us to view the world in a totally different light, let me jump ahead in time and shift focus as I do this just a bit to a paradox associated with another Jewish interlocutor, the Baghdadi ibn Kamuna, as he took to task the argument associated with some post-Suhrawardi philosophers and initially derived from the Avicennian distinctions between necessary and possible and essence and existence, that God's existence can be proven from the very meaning of God's essence as a necessary being. Addressing the by then established claim associated with Avicenna that what's necessary of existence by virtue of itself, or God is a primary notion, and this claims further development in the later tradition that this is a proof for the existence of God by extrapolation or by proceeding from the very meaning of the concept of necessariness itself. Ibn Kamuna is held to have argued that such an extrapolation can be made with regard to more than one being if we stipulate that the object of our reference also belongs in the world of meanings, or that it ceases, in other words, to be unique. From our point of view, the Ibn Kamuna paradox, which may remind us of Yahya's challenge to one of interpretation of what one means, is interesting insofar as it sheds light on the meaning and significance of unique reference. His point, of course, is that so long as the reference one uses, in this case necessary by itself, does not pick out something in the real world, but is restricted to the world of meanings or the mind, it can pick out more than one object. More than one such object could be regarded as self-sufficing, or a necessary by itself being. In one respect, this observation is almost the converse of Leibniz's famous identity of indiscernibles principle. To pick out God, the reference has somehow to be unique. Applied to our case, our use of the description one as set of God, to pick him out also has to be unique. But how could this be so? How could the reference to God, picking him out by the term one, be unique? Al-Kindi's bold and unsubstantiated claim is to stipulate that it is so. It is unique. That used of him, it has a special meaning, which is its original or real meaning. Used of everything else, it has a metaphorical or an analogical meaning. It's not entirely clear that Al-Kindi's distinction would avoid Yahya's observation that if oneness were to uniquely pick out the object being referred to, the thing itself, in this case God, just as a name might, then we would have to acknowledge the presence of two things, oneness and the thing itself, and we would have then to inquire which is prior to which, oneness or the thing itself. Yahya, as well as the Al-Kindi al-Muqammas, used the term the thing itself without troubling with our initial question of whether the being one is the same or not as the thing itself. The main concern in this context is just to distinguish between what might belong or to be possessed by the thing itself by virtue of being itself, and what might belong to it or to be possessed by it as an accident. All three would further agree to distinguish between the thing itself and being a substance, the latter being part of the pair substance and accident, with al-Muqammas, for one, clearly rejecting the treating of God as a substance, partly on account of the pairhood just mentioned. Of the three, only Yahya would consider God to be a substance, though he would point out this substance is invisible, and referring to God would use the thing itself and substance interchangeably. But rather than claiming that oneness is applied to God applies to him as to the thing itself and belongs to him and is possessed by him in this manner, Al-Kindi claims that it belongs to him or is possessed by him in its true meaning, rather than metaphorically, which is how it belongs to everything else. For him, it turns out nothing naturally exists as an individual. I must immediately point out that I'm using the word naturally here as it is commonly used, or as we commonly understand it, in contradistinction to the way Al-Kindi uses it in the text, since Al-Kindi subsumes it Al-Kindi uses the Aristotelian distinction between by accident and by nature, but he actually doesn't take that distinction seriously. And what Aristotle would call by nature, he would say, is so not in reality. So that only in reality, one is only God. So everything for him is a posit. And that the unity or individuality of objects is actually accidental to them. That their being is different from their being one. Now, when Aristotle had first distinguished between something being one by nature and its being one by accident, he did so in what one might call a leisurely or not neutral way, not seeking, the reader feels, to prove a preconceived article of faith. It is therefore not surprising in such a context to see him referring to something being by nature more one than another. For example, the shin or the thigh more than the leg, or even being both one and not one. For instance, a bent line, or something being most truly one, or being primarily called one. As he scans through these different shades of meaning, Aristotle seems to engage in a journey of thinking out loud, of trying to ferret out the different shades of meaning of oneness or unity, distinguishing as he does so between things in the world whose unity comes about from an extraneous cause, like someone being a musician, and those things whose unity seems to be intrinsic to the sorts of things they are, like lines or planes or substances, or what today would be referred to by so-called mass terms like water or wine. We find the same or similar distinctions presented in the works of our three interlocutors, with both Yahya and Al-Muqammas seeming to take more seriously the signification of the underlying generic distinction between what is one by nature and what is one by accident. Al-Kindi, however, and after going along with the Aristotelian scheme, surprises his readers by suddenly breaking off and beginning to present these distinctions as being of a second-class order of importance, precisely by claiming that all of these unities, which are described as being intrinsic, are in fact accidental, metaphorical, and that real unity belongs to God alone. One, Al-Kindi tells us, uniquely refers to the one. I'm almost finished, but now you have my comments on the problem as I see it, which will not take very long. This claim, as we already said, leaves us in something of a philosophical puzzle. We seem to be called upon to believe that the individuation of everything in the world, and with which we are familiar in our common lives, is somehow contingent, that being and being one are different, or that the units of discourse making up our world, whose existence, by the way, is not being put in doubt, could be different. But what could this conceivably mean? Al-Kindi does not tell us. He leaves us with having to imagine what the implications of his claim on our world might mean. Indeed, his own focus is on God, where he believes philosophers' eyes should be focused. But how could we understand him? One way to understand him would be to take as given the actual scatter of the different unities there are in the world. In this case, I see two birds fly over me in the sky. I can say what I just said, or I can say I see a twird flying. Are they two birds, or is it one twird? One version would have it that the actual units out there in the sky, what I would be pointing at each as a this, are genuine and independent unities, for example, those single birds. But another version would have it that there are no genuine units, but birds and twirds and thwords and thwords and so on, as we happen to make them out to be. We can see a forest or a clump of bamboo culms, as in Kyoto or in Maui, as the extended body of a single plant, or we can see a plethora of different bamboo stalks. When we divide the world up as we do, we can imagine Al-Kindi telling us this is not because this is how it's divided up in itself, but because this is how we, probably through the agency of God, have come to see it useful or simplest or whatever for us to divide it up. But this is only one way of understanding Al-Kindi. The other way is to suppose that what he meant was that our actual world could have been different, that instead of there actually being different single birds, there could have been actual different single twords, as two-headed, four-winged, and quadruped avians, or thwords, or twords, or thwords, and so on, or that the very material from which the world is made up could have been molded in entirely different shapes as ultimate unities, it having been chance or the will of God that the actual world is as it is. Al-Kindi's confounding but undeveloped pronouncement on unity later finds expression, I believe, in Avicenna, who manages, through developing this and related themes, such as the distinction between what is necessary of itself and what is necessary only by some cause outside of itself, and by thus reducing the whatness of an object to the same contingent status as its thatness. Not only that it is contingent, but what it is also is contingent. He manages through this to clear a philosophical path between Aristotelian and Platonic worldviews, thereby presenting us with an alternative scheme with which to understand the world, a whole system which weaves the shocking elements of Al-Kindi into an original Eastern tapestry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nusseibeh. After having listened separately to Professor Strumse and to Professor Nusseibeh, we'll now listen to both of them together. This will not be one nor unique, it will be two, a dual. They will present an internet project under construction that they conceived together and now co-direct. After what we already heard tonight, you will not be surprised to hear that the project is about intellectual encounters, specifically between medieval scholars belonging to the three Abrahamic faiths.
Thank you. I think that before we start, I have to correct something that I said before. Or to add to it. I said before that everyone in that period spoke one language, and that was Arabic. And I think that what Sari has shown very clearly is that they all spoke one language, and that is philosophy. And what we try to do in this website is to recreate on the web something that will show how one text leads to the other, and how the various texts create together what Sari very correctly called the tapestry, where the different inputs are woven together. The idea behind this website was that usually, as a slogan, people do say this was a world where people of usually they say the three monotheistic religions. There were other religions too, but this is what people say. The three monotheistic religions were closer, spoke one language, the philosophers worked together. But after the slogan, after saying it, usually what people do is concentrate on their field and leave the other fields to the background. And as both Sari and myself tried to show, you can't really work that way. So on the one hand, we wanted to create a website where a person would come to the website and, for example, look for Yahya ibn Adi or Mukammas or Al-Kindi, and then the website will take this person by the hand, and lead by the head too, and lead him or her to the other texts which are relevant, the ones that he or she did not think about. And the other agenda of the website was, and this was no secret, that some of the people who are interested by these texts are nowadays prevented from working together by modern borders or modern conflicts. And what we try to create is some kind of safe place where they can work together. So here comes after a long gestation of 4 years, here comes the beta version of the intellectual encounters. We're still looking for resources to move it ahead. And the intellectual encounters present, as you can see, it's in 3 languages, Hebrew, English, and Arabic. And the idea is that everything, at the final version, everything will be in these 3 languages. Also in the 3 scripts, Hebrew, Arabic, and English or Latin. And what we can't see in this PowerPoint is that the pictures here, which present philosophers studying together, actually move, and there are many in the art of the period or the period afterwards. You can actually see how natural it was for people in the Middle Ages to assume that philosophers work together. Sorry, you will interrupt me when... Yeah, okay. there are several features to the website. The project goal were to present an innovative website with a digital library of medieval Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and other philosophical writings. If they were free thinkers and didn't identify with any of these, that's fine for us too. And to present a framework for teaching and research, both virtually and face-to-face. Virtually is what is here on the web, and face-to-face is what is echoed in what Sari presented here. We also wanted to create an international network of scholars, students, and lay people dedicated to studying our shared intellectual heritage. And the features of the website include a digital library, a map tool that will place all these things in space, a timeline that will place all these tools in a chronological order, a forum where people can chat, and course pages. So the dynamic website includes the news of the field, what's new, several new books that came out or are about to come out, recent developments in the field, a digital library to the extent that we can put things on the web, Arabic texts like Al-Ghazali or Yahya ibn Adi, Arabic translations of Hebrew texts. There is now in process a translation of Maimonides' halachic work, Mishneh Torah, work which is being prepared by a Palestinian from Ramallah. And Judeo-Arabic texts like Maimonides, his responsa, his epistles, and introductions to the Mishnah are put on the web. And Arabic transliterations of Judeo-Arabic texts, like the Mishneh Torah, which will make these very Jewish texts available for non-Jews. There are also original works in the library, like biographies of Al-Ghazali or Maimonides or Yahya ibn Adi, explanations of concepts to people who may not be familiar with it, like what is Judeo-Arabic, and the timeline which will show how these people react to each other. This is the map, and if you press, for example, the travels of Maimonides, I can't show it here, but it will show how Maimonides left Cordova, went to North Africa, traveled to Saint Jean d'Acre, and then ended in Egypt. The forum is what is normally called chat, and people register and wherever they come from and actually chat. And what did I do wrong? And the courses, which one class of one of these courses you just heard. There were 4 courses in 4 universities, one by Sari in Al-Quds, another by Professor Franz Griffel at Yale, a third one in Germany, and a 4th one in Bar Ilan University in Israel. And to some extent, each of these courses tried to find at least one occasion where by video conference all these students will participate in the other course. Sorry, you can say how well or not so well it worked.
Very quickly, just that we decided that the main field should be something to do with the... We decided that we should focus that the main subject or topic should be the relationship between the faith and reason. And Frank from Yale, who's an expert on Al-Ghazali, basically gave a lecture to all of us in the different universities. And then the students in the different universities actually interacted with Frank over those things that he said. And then we discussed them later within within each classroom. Although, of course, in each classroom we were pursuing something different. Like in my classroom, we were doing the textual readings of the three people I mentioned in my talk, Yahya, Muqammas, but nonetheless, we tried to relate the readings from the different courses to this main theme of the relationship between faith and reason. And eventually, when they went to Morocco, some students were picked up and some professors from different universities, and they went and had a workshop in Morocco on those things. So this is just part of the stuff. And by the way, the students in the different universities were beginning to interact with one another over the stuff that they were studying.
I think what you see here is some highlights from the final workshop in Marrakesh. As you can imagine, to this simple picture that looks so natural, where people just sit and they are doing what students are supposed to do. They sit and read the text. Was a major operation. We were helped by many people. There were all the difficulties that universities face, which you're familiar with, finances, organization. There were all the difficulties of getting the people young and not so young to overcome their suspicions and what will happen tomorrow and what will the news say tomorrow. The end result you can see here, and I think it speaks for itself. And the next steps are, we are looking for partners for further development of the project. We are establishing a network of participating universities and affiliated courses. And we are establishing a consortium of research libraries to contribute material. And I think and I hope that the module which is inaugurated this way will immediately join this consortium. Thank you very much.